Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into something pretty fundamental, the connection between our everyday habits and our brain health.
Yeah.
And to really get to the bottom of this, we're going to be focusing on the insights of Dr. Daniel Amen.
Right.
Now, Dr. Amen is a psychiatrist who has really dedicated his career to understanding the brain. He's actually analyzed an incredible number of brain scans.
Over 260,000 brain scans. That's a lot of brains.
260,000.
Yeah. It's really remarkable the amount of data he's been able to collect.
You shared a great starting point for us to really kind of dig into his work.
Yes.
And that's the transcript of a conversation that he had on a podcast called The Diary of a CEO.
Right.
So our aim today is really to unpack Dr. Amen's perspective and see what practical advice we can glean from his insights.
Absolutely.
We're really trying to understand how everything from what we eat to how we parent our kids can actually have a concrete impact on how our brains work.
Right. And I think what's really fascinating about Dr. Amen's work is that he's worked with such a wide range of people.
Yeah.
I mean, you have individuals like Justin Bieber, Miley Cyrus, Mel Gibson.
What names?
Yeah. And they've openly talked about how his insights have actually influenced their lives.
And that's what makes it, I think, a little bit easier for people to digest maybe sometimes. Because it is very scientific.
It is.
But it feels like something that actually has an impact on everyday people.
Right. It connects to real life.
Yeah, and it feels really relevant right now.
Yeah.
I was thinking about how in 2024, the Oxford University Press chose the word brain rot as their word of the year.
Yeah.
It feels very timely.
It does. It really highlights the growing concern that, all of our modern habits, scrolling, digital overload, all of that could be having a negative impact on our brains.
And at the core of Dr. Amen's message, I think, is this idea that the brain really controls everything.
Yeah.
Our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, even our relationships.
It's the control center for our entire lives.
When it works right, we work right.
Exactly.
I mean, that seems pretty simple on the surface.
Yeah.
But what does that really mean, like in a day-to-day sense?
Well, when you think about it, Dr. Amen suggests that a lot of the issues that we deal with, things like those bad decisions that we just keep making, or the feelings of sadness or anxiety that we just can't shake, or even trouble sleeping, conflicts in our relationships.
Right.
Those often stem from the physical health of our brains.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not just a psychological thing.
Right.
A biological basis in the brain.
Yeah, it's not just all in your head, it's actually your head.
I see. So if we want to start tackling those problems, maybe the starting point isn't just thinking differently, but taking care of the organ that's doing the thinking.
Right. Taking care of your brain.
Yeah. I like that. Now, in the conversation that you shared, the discussion actually takes some pretty interesting turns.
Yes.
And one that really stood out to me was the potential harm of pornography, especially for young developing brains.
Dr. Amen is particularly concerned about the impact of pornography on young brains, especially kids around 8 to 10 years old.
Yeah.
Because at that age, their brains just aren't developed enough to understand, the difference between healthy and unhealthy content, or even, what's real and what's fantasy.
Right. And he describes this mechanism of harm as deadening the nucleus accumbens. Could you explain a bit more about what that means?
So the nucleus accumbens is like the reward center in the brain, and it plays a big role in dopamine production and how we respond to it.
Right.
And, dopamine is essential for all sorts of things: motivation, focus, feelings of pleasure, regulating our mood.
Yeah.
But when this area is constantly flooded with, the really intense stimulation from pornography,
Right.
it can become desensitized.
I see.
Or as Dr. Amen put it, deadened.
So is it kind of like how if you listen to really loud music all the time, eventually your ears just kind of get used to it?
Yeah, it's similar to that.
Okay.
Your brain needs more and more stimulation to get that same feeling of pleasure or reward.
So then you need even louder music, basically, to get the same.
Exactly.
Oh, yeah.
The brain starts craving those more extreme experiences.
And I think he connects that to other things, too.
Yeah.
Like intense gaming, the allure of fame, even the risks of gambling.
Right. It's that same kind of dopamine rush.
Got it. So while pornography is a particular problem for young people because their brains are still developing, the same principle applies to anything that triggers those really fast, intense bursts of dopamine.
Right.
Okay. Let's move on to another area where Dr. Amen presented some really interesting information, and that's alcohol.
Yeah, alcohol is a big one.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting to see how health organizations are starting to change their tune about even moderate drinking. Dr. Amen actually mentioned that the U.S. Surgeon General is even considering adding cancer warning labels to all alcoholic beverages.
Right.
And the American Cancer Society is now recommending that people don't drink any alcohol at all because of the link to cancer.
So it sounds like the negative effects of alcohol, they really do go beyond just the brain.
Absolutely. It affects the whole body.
Yeah.
But, from Dr. Amen's experience looking at thousands of brain scans, he sees firsthand how damaging alcohol can be to the brain.
Really?
He often sees brains of people who drink regularly that look much older than they actually are.
Wow.
And he talked about a study where they actually watched brain activity in a young adult as they got drunk, and the activity in the frontal lobe just plummeted when they became intoxicated.
So it really does affect our decision-making.
Yeah, it's like alcohol takes the brakes off our impulses and judgment.
But, okay, what about those of us who just enjoy, a glass of wine or a beer every now and then?
Right.
Is there truly no safe level when it comes to our brains?
Well, there's the Spanish study that Dr. Amen talked about, and it showed that even mild to moderate drinking was associated with disruptions in the brain's white matter.
The white matter.
Right, those are those nerve cell pathways
Yeah.
that are essential for communication between different parts of the brain.
Oh, so even small amounts of alcohol can affect how well our brains communicate.
Exactly. Think of it like, those highways in your brain that carry information back and forth.
Yeah.
Even a little bit of alcohol can create like little roadblocks or traffic jams,
I see.
slowing everything down.
And I think he also mentioned longer-term consequences, like actual brain shrinkage.
Yeah, and damage to the hippocampus.
And remind me what the hippocampus does again.
Right. So the hippocampus is really important for things like forming new memories, regulating mood, and our sense of spatial awareness.
Right.
Like knowing where you are in space. And Dr. Amen explained that alcohol is a neurotoxin.
Oh,
Yeah.
Hmm.
Meaning it actually damages brain tissue.
so that can actually lead to a smaller brain over time. And then the damage to the hippocampus that can show up as, poor memory.
Trouble with direction.
Right. Brain fog even.
Yeah, and difficulty with mood regulation and making good judgments.
That's a lot to consider. Now let's turn to marijuana, which is another substance that's often seen as being relatively harmless.
Right.
But Dr. Amen had some interesting things to say about that as well.
Yeah, what's interesting is that in his own research using those brain SPECT scans,
Yeah.
Dr. Amen has found that people who regularly use marijuana actually show lower overall brain activity.
Really? In every area?
Yeah, pretty much across the board. And, that really challenges this idea that marijuana doesn't really affect brain function.
And he also mentioned a recent study published in JAMA that seemed to back up those concerns, specifically when it comes to the hippocampus.
Yeah, that JAMA study was huge, over 21,000 people.
A lot of people.
And they found a link between marijuana use and decreased activity in the hippocampus.
Right, so that area that's so critical for memory. And he also raised some concerns about marijuana use, specifically in teenagers,
Right.
and its potential link to mental health problems.
Yeah, Dr. Amen pointed out that teenagers who use marijuana have higher rates of anxiety and depression, and sadly even suicide attempts.
Yeah.
He also questioned, this idea that legalizing marijuana for recreational use is all positive,
Right.
especially given that we're seeing this rise in mental health issues at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complex issue.
It is.
But I did appreciate that he stressed the importance of education and prevention over, things like incarceration, especially when it comes to young people.
Yeah, I thought that was important too.
Okay, so moving on. The conversation they shifted to what's being called the psychedelic renaissance,
Right.
where you have substances like psilocybin and ketamine that are making a comeback in psychiatric research and treatment.
Yeah, it's interesting to see those substances coming back into the spotlight.
But Dr. Amen seemed to have a pretty cautious stance on this.
Yeah, he does. He draws these parallels to other times in history when we've gotten really excited about certain drugs, only to find out later that they have some pretty serious downsides.
Oh, like what?
Well, like benzodiazepines, for example.
Right.
Or even how alcohol used to be seen as this health food,
Oh, yeah.
or the more recent opioid crisis.
Yeah.
And he's worried that we might be making those same mistakes again with psychedelics.
I see. And there's been an increase in cases of psychosis associated with psilocybin use, right?
Yeah, there has, which is definitely concerning.
Yeah.
And, Dr. Amen really emphasizes that we need a lot more research
Yeah.
before we start using these substances widely.
Right, because what might be helpful for one person could be really harmful for someone else.
Exactly. We need to understand those individual differences.
Okay. And I thought his analogy of thinking about depression like chest pain was really interesting.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
Can you explain that a bit more?
So what he's saying is that depression isn't just one thing. It's a symptom that can have lots of different underlying causes.
Okay.
It could be trauma, negative thought patterns, even physical things like thyroid problems or infections.
So just treating everyone who has depression with antidepressants without figuring out what's causing it.
Right.
That's like giving everyone who has chest pain the same medication.
Exactly.
It's not going to work for everyone.
And it might even be harmful for some people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Which brings us to the whole issue of antidepressant overprescription, especially here in the U.S.
Right. We use a lot of antidepressants in this country.
More than anywhere else in the world.
More than anywhere else.
And I think Dr. Amen pointed to a few reasons for that.
Yeah, he thinks it's partly because people want a quick fix, and also because most antidepressant prescriptions are written by doctors who aren't psychiatrists.
Right.
Often in really short appointments.
Where they don't really have time to delve into what might be causing the problem.
Exactly.
And I think another important point he made is that antidepressants, they might help manage symptoms,
Right.
but they don't actually solve the underlying issues.
They don't get to the root of the problem.
And sometimes they can even lead to dependence.
Right.
So are there any other alternatives?
Well, Dr. Amen talked about a few natural alternatives that have shown some promise in research.
Yeah, like what?
Things like saffron.
The spice saffron.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And it's actually been found to be as effective as some SSRIs.
Really?
Yeah, and potentially with fewer side effects.
That's cool. Anything else?
Yeah. Regular exercise like walking, omega-3 fatty acids, and learning how to manage those negative thought patterns.
Right, those ANTs.
Automatic negative thoughts.
Yeah.
We often go through life without really being taught how to deal with those.
Right, it's like we're not given the tool.
Exactly. But learning to recognize and challenge those negative thoughts and even intentionally cultivating a more positive outlook, that can have a huge impact on our mental and emotional well-being.
So it's not just about what we put into our bodies.
Okay.
It's also about how we think.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the conversation then moved into the impact of trauma on the brain,
Yeah.
but also this really amazing capacity for post-traumatic growth.
Right.
And what I thought was fascinating is that these brain SPECT scans that Dr. Amen uses,
Yeah.
they can actually show specific patterns in brain activity that are often associated with trauma.
Right. Like heightened activity in the limbic system.
The emotional center of the brain,
Exactly. And in the anterior cingulate gyrus.
which helps us be more flexible in our thinking and regulate our emotions.
Right.
And then he talked about the ACE score.
Adverse childhood experiences.
Yeah, and the connection between having a higher ACE score and an increased risk of health problems later in life.
Right. It's pretty clear that trauma can have long-lasting effects.
But the example of Elizabeth Smart that he shared, that was really inspiring.
Yeah. Her story is a really powerful example of post-traumatic growth.
Right, because she went through unimaginable trauma, but instead of just being defined by that,
Right.
she turned her experiences into something positive.
Exactly. She became an advocate.
Yeah. And this idea of brain reserve, that's fascinating too.
Yeah. Brain reserve is basically like extra brain power.
I like that.
Yeah. It's the extra capacity our brains have to cope with stress and adversity.
And that's influenced by both our genes and our life experiences, right?
Even going all the way back to before we were born.
So it's like we can actively build up our brain reserve throughout our lives.
Exactly.
Okay. Let's talk about Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
Dr. Amen had a really interesting perspective on this.
He does. He doesn't think it's all about those amyloid plaques.
Yeah.
He thinks it's much more complex than that.
So he actually came up with this mnemonic, Bright Minds,
Right.
to help people remember the 11 major risk factors.
It stands for blood flow, retirement, and aging.
Inflammation, genetics, head trauma, toxins,
Mental health,
Yeah.
infections, neurohormones,
diabetes,
and
sleep.
it's a lot to remember. But I think that connection between diabetes and Alzheimer's, that's really interesting.
It is. Some researchers are even calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes.
Because it's so closely linked to insulin resistance.
Right?
And he talked about a study that showed a 400% increased risk of Alzheimer's.
Yeah, 400%.
in people who eat a lot of simple carbohydrates
That's the typical standard American diet.
compared to people who eat more of a fat-based diet.
Exactly.
So what we eat really can have a huge impact on our brain health.
No question about it.
Okay, so then the conversation moved into the realm of emotions,
Right.
specifically grief and hope.
Yeah. And what's so fascinating is how these different emotions actually activate specific parts of our brains.
Really?
Yeah.
So like what happens in the brain when we're grieving?
So grief activates areas in the limbic system.
Emotional brain. Right. Specifically the insular cortex and the thalamus.
Interesting.
And Dr. Amen describes how losing someone you love can actually create a void in the brain.
A void.
Yeah, like in the areas where the neural representation of that person was stored.
That's so sad.
It is. And it's
Yeah.
important to note that alcohol actually makes it harder for our brains to manage those intense feelings of grief.
Because it impairs the prefrontal cortex.
Right.
So even though we might want to turn to alcohol for comfort when we're grieving,
Right.
it might actually be making things worse.
It might be. Now, on the flip side, hope.
Yeah.
That seems to be linked to activity in the insular cortex as well.
So the same area that's involved in grief.
Right. But when we feel hopeless,
Yeah.
we often lose faith in our ability to change things.
We feel like we don't have control.
Exactly.
Hey, and he mentioned this tool called the one-page miracle.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a really cool exercise designed to help people clarify their goals and figure out how to align their actions with those goals.
To give them a sense of purpose
Right.
and hope.
Exactly.
Okay, let's switch gears now and talk about parenting
Yeah.
and how we can raise kids with healthy brains.
Right. And I think Dr. Amen made a really important point here.
What's that?
He said we should be focusing on raising mentally strong and resilient kids who have good self-esteem.
Okay, so it's not about trying to create the perfect brain.
Right. It's about helping kids develop the skills they need to thrive in the real world.
And how do we do that?
Well, he talked about the importance of strong bonds with our kids,
Yeah.
spending quality time with them,
Like what?
even just 20 minutes a day of child-led activity.
Okay, so letting them choose what they want to do.
Right. And really listening to them actively.
What does active listening mean?
It means not just hearing what they're saying, but really trying to understand their feelings.
And reflecting those feelings back to them.
Exactly.
Okay, and then he talked about not rescuing our kids from every challenge.
Right.
It's tempting to want to do that.
It is.
But he said it can actually undermine their sense of competence.
Yeah. If we always step in and fix things for them,
Right.
they don't learn how to do things for themselves.
Okay. So we need to let them make mistakes and learn from them.
Within reason, of course.
Of course.
But it's important for them to develop that sense of, I can handle this.
I see. And he also stressed how important it is for parents to model healthy behaviors themselves.
Yeah. Actions speak louder than words.
Right. If we're telling our kids to eat healthy foods, but we're constantly snacking on junk food,
Right.
they're going to notice.
They are.
And then he talked about setting clear boundaries
Yeah. Like a consistent tantrum, no rule.
to teach kids self-regulation.
Exactly.
Okay. So moving on to ADHD,
Yeah.
Dr. Amen had some interesting insights on this as well.
Yeah. He believes that ADHD is a real condition with a genetic component.
Right.
But he also thinks our modern environment makes it worse.
In what way?
Oh, with all the sugar and the gadgets and the lack of outdoor time,
Yeah.
it's like we're creating the perfect storm for ADHD to thrive.
And he talked about some pretty serious consequences of not treating ADHD.
Yeah. Things like school failure, trouble with the law, financial problems, even divorce.
And he shared his personal experience with his own daughter,
Right.
who has ADHD.
Yeah.
And for her, medication was really life-changing.
It was. It allowed her to focus and control her impulses and really thrive.
Wow. That's amazing.
It is. But it's important to remember that medication isn't the answer for everyone.
Right.
And Dr. Amen also pointed out that people with ADHD can actually focus really well on things that are novel or interesting or stimulating or even frightening.
Okay, so it's not that they can't focus at all.
Right. It's that they have trouble focusing on things that aren't captivating to them.
I see.
And he also cautioned against self-medicating with stimulants.
Right, because that can lead to dependence and other problems.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, the conversation briefly touched on the neuroscience of love.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how different types of love actually show up in the brain.
So what did he say about that?
Well, he explained that new love is all about dopamine.
Dopamine. So that's why we get those feelings of intense focus and even obsession with our new partner.
Exactly.
Yes.
But lasting love,
Yeah.
that's more like opiates.
Interesting.
Yeah. Which explains why it feels so good to be in a long-term loving relationship.
And why heartbreak can be so painful.
Right. It's like going through withdrawal.
Wow.
And he also found that people who are heartbroken actually show patterns of both anxiety and sadness in their brain activity.
That makes sense.
And the neural representation of the person they've lost.
Yeah.
That's still active in many parts of the brain.
Oh, that's so sad.
It is.
Okay. So Dr. Amen then shared his vision for improving global brain health.
Yeah. And it's a simple but powerful message.
What is it?
He wants everyone to start asking themselves this question. Is what I'm doing right now good for my brain or bad for it?
I like that.
Yeah. It's about being mindful of our choices.
Yeah, and taking care of our brains.
And exactly. He believes that if we start making more brain-healthy decisions, we can all experience a significant improvement in our overall well-being.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense that if our brains are healthier,
Right.
we're going to be healthier overall.
Exactly.
Okay. So speaking of what's good or bad for our brains, you and Dr. Amen talked about some current trends
We did.
and their potential impact on our brain health.
Right. And it's mixed bag.
Yeah.
Some things are great, like paddleball and pickleball.
Those are really good for the brain,
Yeah, they're great for the cerebellum.
which helps with coordination.
Right. And for the frontal lobes, which are involved in planning and decision-making.
I see. What about those brain training apps?
Some of them can be helpful, especially you combine them with exercise.
Yeah.
Mindfulness and meditation are really good too,
Yeah.
especially Kirtan Kriya,
Okay.
which is a specific type of meditation that Dr. Amen has studied.
And what about cold showers?
Cold showers can give you a short-term boost of dopamine,
Really?
but you have to be careful with extreme cold.
Right.
Having a job that you love and that challenges you to learn new things,
Yeah.
that's fantastic for your brain.
But working in a toxic environment,
Yeah,
that can be really bad.
it can.
What about breath work?
Breath work is excellent for calming the nervous system.
Okay.
But spending too much time on social media can lead to negative social comparisons,
Right.
which can be bad for our mental health.
Yeah.
And then there's workaholism,
Yeah.
which can be either good or bad depending on why you're working so much.
And what about things like microplastics and noise pollution?
Those are definitely bad for the brain.
Okay. So now let's talk about AI,
Yeah,
artificial intelligence.
right.
That's a big topic these days,
It is.
and it's moving so fast.
It is.
Dr. Amen had some concerns about how AI might affect our brains
Yeah, he's worried that we might start using our brains less.
because AI is doing more of the work for us.
Right.
Yeah.
And that could have some negative consequences.
So he thinks we need to find ways to use AI to enhance our cognitive abilities,
Right.
not replace them.
Exactly.
And he also cautioned against relying on AI for medical advice.
Yeah.
And he's worried about artificial social connections replacing real human interaction.
Right.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that technology can be a tool,
Right.
but it shouldn't replace real-life experiences.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so finally, the deep dive ended with a discussion on the importance of purpose and spirituality.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah. Dr. Amen talked about how having a sense of purpose in life is linked to lower rates of depression, loneliness, and even dementia.
Wow. That's pretty significant.
It is. And he encourages everyone to really explore what gives their life meaning.
To find their why.
Exactly.
And he also talked about the connection between science and spirituality.
Yeah. He's fascinated by the neuroscience of religious experiences.
Yeah.
And he mentioned studies on prayer and channeling
Oh, wow.
that have shown changes in brain activity.
So it's not just a subjective experience.
Right. It's actually happening in the brain.
And those practices, prayer and meditation, they have lots of benefits for the brain, right?
They do. They can strengthen the prefrontal cortex, reduce stress, increase dopamine, improve connectivity, and even promote neuroplasticity.
Remind me what neuroplasticity is again.
Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change and adapt.
Right. So it's like keeping our brains young and flexible.
Exactly.
He also talked about the impact of trauma on first responders
Right?
and how they're at higher risk for things like suicide.
Yeah. Their jobs are incredibly stressful and demanding,
Right.
and they're exposed to a lot of trauma.
So he really emphasized the need for more support and resources for first responders.
Yes. They deserve all the help we can give them.
Absolutely. And for listeners who want to support brain health research,
Right.
the Change Your Brain Foundation is a great resource.
Their website is changeyourbrain.org.
Perfect. And lastly, Dr. Amen offered some advice for couples who are planning to start a family.
Right. A listener asked about that.
Yeah.
And he stressed the importance of both partners getting healthy before conception.
Oh, so not just the woman.
Right. Both
Yeah.
partners.
Okay.
And he said ideally they should start preparing a year or more in advance.
Wow.
Yeah. It's all about optimizing nutrition, managing stress, and adopting those brain healthy habits. Together. And he reminded us how quickly the brain develops in those early stages of pregnancy.
Right. It's amazing how much happens in those first few weeks.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the key takeaway is that the choices we make every day, they have a profound impact on the health of our brains.
Yeah. We have a lot more control over our brain health than we might think.
Right. And it's never too late to start making changes.
Exactly.
And I think Dr. Amen's question is a great one to keep in mind.
Is what I'm doing right now good for my brain or bad for it?
Yeah. That's a great question to ask ourselves throughout the day.
It is. It helps us make more conscious choices.
So we encourage you to check out the Change Your Brain Foundation website.
Yeah, they have a ton of great resources there.
And really think about how you can apply these insights to your own life.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for taking this deep dive with us.